Welcome everyone. We're just going to wait a few more minutes as we still have some joining us, and then we'll get started shortly. Well, welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. I see a lot of people are already online. We may have a few additional joining us, but we'll go ahead and start the informational webinar on the draft temporary water quality standards variance rules. So just to welcome everyone, this is a webinar that we're using through Zoom. So we will be giving a presentation today, and then at the end, there'll be some time for questions, and you're welcome to type those into the chat. So if you look at the right hand of your screen, you'll see that there is a visual there. And at the bottom, it will show what the Zoom screen controls look like, which has a chat, a raise hand feature, and a Q&A feature. And if you click on that Q&A, you can type your question in there, and that will come to us, and we'll read those and answer those. You can also raise your hand. So that's kind of the middle button there. You could raise your hand and we will call on you and unmute you to be able to speak during that time for the Q&A. And then you're also welcome to type into the chat, but the Q&A probably is the quickest way for questions. If you're calling by phone, please press *9 to raise your hand when we reach that point. And as always, we just like to know who you are, so we can kind of put a name to the comments and assist you in answering that. So if you please state your name and affiliation before providing your comment. So our agenda today, the meeting purpose is to have our water quality standards staff explain the content and the intent of the draft variance rules. And then in that, we're going to go ahead and go over that rule overview and then have a question and answer session. And I am just going to address, there's some comments in the chat. Hopefully everyone is hearing us okay. Can you all hear us? Can you type into the chat if you're hearing us okay? Like Ed, okay, sounds fine. Okay, good, thank you. Appreciate that feedback. We just want to make sure everyone can hear us. Great. All right, well, we'll go ahead and I'll turn it over to Myla Kelly to talk about water quality standards.
Great, thanks, Moira. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Myla Kelly. I manage our water quality standards and modeling section. And today, myself and Mike Suplee are going to be talking about a proposed rule that we have that we would like to move forward regarding water quality standards variances. So I'm gonna give a little bit of background on water quality standards variances, kind of the framework of the rule, and then we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into some of the aspects and the background, the importance of some of the really key concepts in that rule. Mike is going to do some of that, and then we're going to wrap up with some information on what the rulemaking timeline is and opportunities for comment. So we're going to start here with just the basics of water quality standards. And water quality standards are essentially the way in which we define and determine clean water. And we do that using three different sort of legs of that water quality standards stool. The first is the beneficial uses, and we define what the beneficial uses are for our waterways, how we are going to use that water. And these are things such as recreation, aquatic life, drinking water, agriculture. These are all beneficial uses. The second component of water quality standards is the water quality criteria itself. So that's sort of the number, or it could be a narrative, kind of a statement, or so it could be numeric, it could be narrative, and we have water quality criteria for hundreds of pollutants, and that criteria defines the limit of the pollutant below which we have confidence that that water is clean. And that water, those criteria can be different for depending on the beneficial use. So those numbers, whether it's numeric or narrative, can be different for things like drinking water or human health versus protection of aquatic life. So that's the second important component of water quality standards. And then the third component is our non-degradation provisions. And this is the concept where we ensure that our high quality waters are protected. So we don't necessarily want all of our waters to get to that level of the water quality standard. If it's below that standard, we want it to stay as a high quality water for whatever pollutant it is that we're looking at. So go ahead to the next slide, please, Moira. Thanks. So those are our water quality standards. And then today we're talking about water quality standards variances. And so I want to give a little bit of explanation on what that means, where they come from, why we use variances. And water quality standards variances are a Clean Water Act tool. Those federal regulations, it is a component of the Clean Water Act. And those federal regulations are outlined in 40 CFR 131.14. There's a suite of regulations that go along with implementing water quality standards variances. Variances are a time-limited, customized water quality standard. So they are in and of themselves a water quality standard. And the variance identifies the highest attainable condition that is applicable throughout the term of the variance. This is a really key component that is required under federal regulations. It is a part of a variance. And Mike is going to talk in much more detail about what that means, how we determine what the highest attainable condition is, and talk about that term of the variance. So he's going to talk about that in quite a bit more detail in just a few slides. But a variance is a tool to be used if the water quality standard can't be met due to specific factors. And those factors, again, are specified in the federal regulations, and I'll talk about what those factors are. But again, it's a tool, it's a time-limited tool that can be used if that standard is just not attainable, if it can't be met at this time due to a number of different factors that we'll talk about in a minute. Water quality standards variances are preferable to permanent removal and downgrade of a water body's beneficial uses. So I think of it sort of as a bridge in time. So if there's a chance that this water quality standard can be met in the future, then the the variance is really that bridge of getting from where we are now to that standard. It allows time for treatment technology to advance and to become less cost prohibitive in some cases. Variances are designed to encourage compliance with the Montana Water Quality Act and the Federal Clean Water Act within a reasonable time frame. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of words on this slide, but I do think it's important to go through these factors that I was just mentioning one by one. And the last factor that I'll get to, the one that's bolded, is the one that we have used in Montana and the one that is most often used with water quality standards variances. But there are other factors that can be used to justify a variance. The first is if there are naturally occurring pollutant concentrations that are preventing the attainment of that beneficial use. The second is natural, ephemeral, intermittent, or low flow conditions that prevent that attainment of that use. So that's really a flow issue. The third is if there are human-caused conditions or sources of pollution that are preventing the attainment of that use and that it can't be remediated, or it would cause more environmental damage to correct than to leave in place. The fourth are dams, diversions, or other types of hydrologic modifications that are precluding the attainment of the use. The fifth are physical conditions related to the natural features of the water body, such as a lack of proper substrate, cover, flow, depth, pools, riffles, and the like, unrelated to water quality, but they're nonetheless precluding the attainment of aquatic life protection uses. And the final is that in meeting the water quality standard would result in substantial and widespread economic and social impact. And so that is something that that Mike will talk about in a few minutes. And yes, Rika, these are all factors that are laid out in 130 in 40 CFR. Oh, I can't remember. Do you remember off the top of your head, Mike? It's like 10 something G. We'll find that reference for you, Rika. But that yes, they are. These are all factors that are laid out in the federal regulations. Next slide, please. 131.10G. That just came into my head. I think it's that. So our new rule. So the rule that we're proposing, that we're talking about today, is a new rule for temporary water quality standards variances. These rules are implementing rules for 2019 legislation. This is legislation that's found in 75-5-320. And that legislation says that the department may adopt rules providing criteria and procedures for the department to issue a temporary variance to water quality standards if a number of conditions are met that I haven't listed out there, but they're listed in our rule, or they're incorporated into our rule. And this legislation was put forward in 2019 to really just open the toolbox for the state of Montana to utilize all of the variance options or tools that EPA has laid out in their regulations. And so this legislation is telling us as a state agency that we can write rules so that we can use all of the aspects where applicable of water quality standards variances that the federal regulations have laid out. So again, because these rules require conformance with 40 CFR 131.14, they are applicable to all pollutants, not just nutrients, which we've been talking about quite a bit lately, but they are applicable to all pollutants and all of the available variance factors that we were just talking about. They're also modeled closely after some variance rules that we adopted and that were approved by EPA in 2018. Now, those variance rules were specific, again, to some legislation, but they were specific to upstream anthropogenic sources. So the importance of these rules is to just allow, kind of open that toolbox, so to speak, for any variance that falls under the applicable factors and considerations in federal law. Next slide, please. Okay, so one aspect of the rule, and you would see it in sections 3 and 4 of new rule 1, and that describes instances where an alternative to a variance may be applicable and eliminate the need for a variance. So these are things like a permit compliance schedule, reuse, trading, land application opportunities, or a TMDL where the permittee is meeting the waste load allocation. So the rule itself actually outlines what those instances are where an alternative could be found, and the importance of, and DEQ would work with a permittee to determine whether there were any alternatives. And this is really important because the development of a variance is definitely a commitment of time and effort on both the permittee side and DEQ side as well. It is a water quality standard, so it does require review and approval by EPA. It functions as a temporary time-limited water quality standard. So there is, it certainly is it's a comprehensive process to go through. And so in the rule, we've outlined just what those possible instances are where an alternative may be more appropriate for the permittee than a variance. And with that, I'm going to turn it to Mike to talk about these key concepts of highest attainable condition.
Next slide. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Mike Sipley here at DEQ. I'm in the Water Quality Standards section with MILA. So the rule mentions this thing called highest attainable condition. It's mentioned in the federal regulations that MILA referenced. It's also in our rule. And I think we've had a number of questions about what exactly that is. So I'm going to try to explain a little bit about what it is going forward here. So in the federal regulations, the highest attainable condition is described as the highest attainable interim criterion or interim effluent condition that reflects the greatest pollution reduction achievable. Now, in Montana, because we've worked with variances for some years already, this is translated as the highest cost for effluent treatment a community would be asked to pay based on the state's economic affordability process. This affordability process, which I'm going to go into detail on, ties back to that sixth factor that Mila showed you, the one about widespread economic and social impacts. And it's well worked out for publicly owned systems here. And I'm going to show you the process as it's currently structured in these next slides. Okay, so just some background on the economic affordability process that we'll be looking at here. It was developed by DEQ along with municipalities, wastewater engineers, environmental advocates, and other Montana stakeholders in the late 2000s. We worked on this primarily between about 2008 and 2010. It's accepted by EPA. It's modeled generally on their 1995 guidance, but with a number of modifications to make it a better fit to Montana. And in fact, when we submitted this, we were complimented on the improvements that we had made to the 95 guidance approach by the EPA at that time. So it's got a number of steps. I'm just going to walk through the steps in words here, and then I'll show you an example of what it leads to. So the first step in this economic affordability process, again, tying back to that factor six, and is this too expensive to be afforded, is an estimate has to be made of the project cost that would be put in place to meet this new water quality standard or whatever water quality standard someone's seeking a variance from, for meeting that standard, and then calculate that as an annual cost. The second step was to calculate the total annualized pollution control cost per household, including existing wastewater fees, which is very important. So how much people are paying now comes into this equation, plus the new pollution control project and what that would project out as an increase in the household wastewater bill. The third step is to calculate something called municipal preliminary screener score. And that's based on the new wastewater fees and the community's median household income. And this step identifies communities that can readily pay for this upgrade versus those that cannot. So that's why it's a screener. Next, so the fourth step is assuming someone is still moving forward in this process, we carry out what's called a secondary test to derive a secondary score. The key aspect of this test, and these were very carefully reviewed, I might add, and even updated and modified by the group that I mentioned back in the late 2000s. This test characterizes the socioeconomic and financial well-being of households in a community, and it's comprised of 5 evaluation parameters which are compared against state averages. And these factors are the poverty rate of the community, the percent low to median income in the community, the unemployment rate, the median household income, or MHI. And then this is one that we specifically developed here in Montana, property tax, fees, and revenues divided by MHI and indexed by population. In a nutshell, what that means is how much burden is the community already bearing due to existing property taxes, fees, and other types of things of that nature. And so that we have that in there as well. So those are all looked at. Once those are averaged, you move to step 5 and you assess where the community falls in a matrix. And the matrix evaluates whether a community is expected to incur substantial economic impacts due to the implementation of this new water pollution control project. If the applicant shows that they will show substantial impacts, then the applicant can move on to the widespread test. If you recall, that factor 6 talked about substantial and widespread. So this is structured to have basically a substantial test and a widespread test, and they're both looked at. The widespread test, which is step 6, comprises questions that ask the applicant about current economic, social, and population trends in the affected area. Is the town growing quickly? You know, that example, that would be Bozeman, or is it tending to shrink and losing population, which has been very common among our small towns in many areas. So those kinds of things are considered. Finally, the 7th step, if widespread impacts are shown, then the applicant is eligible for an individual variance because they've demonstrated both substantial and widespread. And also after they demonstrate that they've considered the alternatives to a discharge, to a variance, like Myra mentioned earlier, such as land application, a permit compliance schedule, or other factors. And that's kind of spelled out in the rule too. All right, so at that point, we come to what I guess we have called the remedy. So if a community is trying to meet a water quality standard of some type, and they've gone through this process and they've showed that they would have substantial and widespread impacts from trying to meet it financially, then what is the remedy? It varies according to 2 components as shown on this graph. So the secondary score, which I mentioned earlier, which is basically comprised of those different socioeconomic factors such as poverty rate, median household income, how many fees, etc., is the community already bearing. That's on the y-axis, the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis is the cost cap that the community would be expected to pay for wastewater treatment based on the other score. So here, I have 2 examples to explain how this works. So for in this particular example, let's say we have a community who went through this process. They had substantial and widespread impacts demonstrated, and they got a secondary score of 2. So that's there on that vertical axis. The affordability cap, as you can read across there, would be held to no higher than 1.5% of the median household income, including the amount that's currently being spent on the sewer bill. Now, if the community is currently paying greater than 1.5% of median household income for wastewater, they're done. The community would not have to upgrade its wastewater treatment due to the water quality standard. They would maintain their water quality treatment at the current level under the variance going forward into the future. Next slide. Now this is a case that's a little bit different. Again, we have a community where the secondary score was 2, again on that vertical axis, and the affordability cap is 1.5%. of the median household income, again, including the amount of money that they're currently spending on the sewer bill. But if that community is currently paying, for example, 1% of median household income for wastewater, then the facility would be required to upgrade wastewater treatment with the dollar value differential between 1 and 1.5% as annualized as operation and maintenance costs to be applied to the water treatment facility. And under that set of circumstances, the variance would be granted and the work to upgrade that facility would then go in place under that variance. Okay. So that's just a basic overview of what we've done so far. You know, of all those 6 factors, the one we have the most experience with is that 6th one, because we've done quite a lot of that. For example, the community of Whitefish received an individual variance based on this exact process as you've just seen. The other factors exist, but we have not worked a lot with them. And there's not as many examples of them being used nationally either, but they are available for this process. So who knows, we may be working with some of those as well. So one of the requirements in the rule is that if if a community receives a variance for a water quality standard, they should, they're required to carry out an optimization study. That's actually part of the application process. And that should be looking at facility operations and maintenance of the existing infrastructure. And generally, and we've had a lot of conversations of this type with our earlier manifestation of the nutrient work group, it should generally not result in rate increases or major investments in major concrete changes in the facility. There might be some minor changes, but it's not intended to be, that's not what optimization is about. Optimization is making the most out of what you already have. Next slide. This is a graph that we've used for a while to show some of the benefits of facility optimization. Here's a facility along the High Line here in Montana, and through optimization alone, over the course of about 2 years, you can see that they brought their total nitrogen down from somewhere in the ballpark of about 25 milligrams per liter in their discharge to consistently around 3 to 5. And all that was done purely through optimization. So that's part of the reason it's valuable to include that. And it is part of the rule because it can result in very large water treatment improvements in and of itself. Next slide. So if a community went through the variance process, they got it approved, part of the requirements is that the actions identified in the optimization study, which was part of the application, would be implemented at the facility as part of their NPDES permit. So that's in our new rule here as well. Okay, there's another aspect of this rule. And again, these are mirrored in both federal and our new state rule, and they're already in the federal regulations. There's something in there called a pollutant minimization program. And it's kind of confusing because it's easy to mix it up with the optimization, but it is somewhat distinct. The pollutant minimization program is another round of activities that's taken to try to do the best to control whatever pollutant it is that's part of the variance. But it kicks in after the highest attainable condition of the variance is achieved, because that might not be achieved right away. So some facilities might take a year or two to do the necessary upgrades to get to their highest attainable condition, whatever that might be. But once it's achieved, the pollutant minimization program comprises activities that are basically beyond facility optimization and beyond the basic achievement of the highest attainable condition. It's included in new rule 1 at the citation shown there. And as I said, it's been in the federal regulations for quite a number of years already. They're at 40 CFR 131.14. So what do these things look like? What do these PMPs look like? This is something we have not had a lot of experience working with yet, but there are a number of examples of things that are considered to fall under it. So for example, the facility might be asked to examine, whether there are breweries or distilleries that are sending effluent to their facility. What's in their cleaning compounds? How do they dispose of any cleaning water? Do they do any recycling? Do they do any pretreatment? What about laundries? What's in their cleaning compounds? Anything unusual? Anything that should be of concern? Or truck pollutants? Some places receive truck pollutants from other areas, septic pump out stations, etc. Restaurants or hospitals. Are there any potential things such as nutrient sources related to the discharge of food waste, soaps, or detergent? Or perhaps, depending on what the water quality standard is that you're concerned with, there might even be some point in looking into illicit or non-illicit connections to sewers regarding that particular pollutant. And then along with the PMP are any actions to help address any of the above that the applicant can identify, if there are such actions that can be taken up. Okay. What's that title?
Variance is developed by DEQ.
Oh, okay, right, yeah. This part here is under the section 10 of the new rule, and it talks about cases where DEQ may actually develop a variance. In many cases, permittees will lead the work to support their application for an individual variance, and we would expect that actually to be the norm. And DEQ will work closely with the permittee and EPA in this process. But we believe for some pollutants, there are situations which may arise where DEQ itself may develop a variance or variances. So for example, DEQ has indicated to one of our other advisory groups, the nutrient work group, that a multi-discharger variance for nutrients for small community wastewater lagoons is probably a good approach. There's a fairly high degree of commonality among wastewater lagoon systems in small communities. It's something that DEQ would have more resources to lead the effort on and put in place. And we have experience with it from earlier work we've done here in the department. Mila, did you want to cover this one?
Yep. Yeah, sure. I can take these last couple slides and then we'll open it up to questions. I'm sure there's a lot of material in these 20-something slides. So before we go to questions, though, I want to talk about what the procedure is for when a permittee comes in to apply for a variance. I want to talk about that procedural overview. The first step is the application process, and I think that the rule does a good job of laying out what those key components are that are required within that application. And Mike and I touched on some of those things just now, but they include what the pollutant or pollutants, there could be multiple pollutants, are, the applicable variance factor, so that's one of those 6 factors that we were just talking about, a demonstration that the variance will not lower current water quality, so that's current ambient water quality, a demonstration that the water quality standard cannot be met, a facility optimization study, and the proposed highest attainable condition and the term of the variance. So all of those are key components to the application, and the proposed highest attainable condition, if approved by EPA, becomes the temporary water quality standard. It becomes that is the variance value, which is equivalent to the water quality standard for that term of the variance, which means that it will get implemented into the MPDS permit. So that's a very important critical piece. So once the application comes in, and we would imagine that DEQ would be working closely with the applicant through that first phase. But then once it is officially comes through the door and the application is submitted, then there would be a DEQ review. And assuming that DEQ accepts that variance application, we would begin a 45-day public comment period and a hearing. After that, with DEQ approval conditions or a denial, if there is DEQ approval, then it will move forward to EPA. We will submit that. DEQ will submit that on behalf of the permittee to EPA, and that needs to be done within 30 days of it being put into state law. So DEQ will submit that to EPA for EPA approval or disapproval, and once the variance is approved both under state law and federal law, then the variance can be used in NPDES permits. And one critical component, and this is a federal requirement, is that variances require a reevaluation every 5 years. So it's highly possible that a variance term may be 10 years or whatever that term may be. It's highly possible it will be longer than 5 years. However, after 5 years, a reevaluation of the highest attainable condition does need to be made. Next slide. So for this particular rulemaking, so I wanted just to lay out what those pre-rulemaking opportunities are to comment and to learn about this. We've got this webinar today. It will be recorded and posted. I'm not sure where exactly, but I'm sure Moira will let us know. So we have this webinar. We've got the Q&A after this webinar. We will go through this same information, and if we hear comments from you all today that you want to hear more about certain aspects, we're happy to roll that into our next presentation to the nutrient work group, which is June 22nd from 9 to 11. That's, of course, as always, open to the public. And then we will also have a further additional meeting with our Water Pollution Control Advisory Committee, our council. That meeting is June 24th from 10 to 11. That again will go through this much of this same information, and again we'll be accepting your comments and suggestions, and if we have suggestions from the previous meeting, we'll try and roll that into the WIPCAC meeting on Friday the 24th. And then our rulemaking timeline for this variance rule, we would like to begin we would like to submit it to and publish the notice in the Montana Administrative Record. The publication would occur July 8th. 2022, so this July, and that would kick off a 45-day public comment period during which we will have a public hearing on August 18th. The department will respond to comments, and then the department head will sign the rule no later than September 27th. The rule being filed no later than September 27th means it will publish by October 7th. So that is our intended timeline for this variance rule.
Thank you, Mila, and thank you, Mike. I'm going to go ahead and move into questions at this time.